So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shannon Bacon, and I am the Chief Justice of the New Mexico Supreme Court. Thank you for inviting me today. I wish I could be there in person, but I'm also teaching at the law school this afternoon, and they're in two very different places in our beautiful state. So I appreciate you letting me beam in despite navigating technical difficulties to get here. So thanks for your patience. So first, I want to give a shout out to the League of Women Voters. I fancy that when I retire, I would want to join your ranks. I think it is a really valuable, it has a really valuable mission. And at least for me, as one of those, I vote in every election, including dog catcher. I find what you all do to be particularly helpful because of its neutrality. And I know that that is the focus of the league. And I really appreciate that. I appreciated it when I was in private practice many, many moons ago. I was the lawyer for the Democratic Party and for many presidential elections. And I would always get kind of inquisitive looks from electeds because my point of view is that if you're registered to vote, doesn't matter what party you're in, we should be facilitating your opportunity to vote. It's not about voter suppression. And that to me always seemed both consistent with the mission of the league, but also is one of the things that led me to think, maybe I want to be a judge. Because I like to look at both sides of things and to spend my time and energy applying the rules fairly to everyone, which is what I tried to do when I was running elections in New Mexico. So that's kind of the thread between where I started and where I am now and the work that you do. So that as I was thinking about things to say to you all today, it really, the theme or the topic from my perspective, and by the way, I love to answer questions. So do not be shy about asking questions about any and everything that you are interested in. But I'm really concerned as a member of the Supreme Court, a member of the judiciary, about the erosion in the confidence in democracy and the erosion in the rule of law. And as the Chief Justice, I have this great fortune to attend conferences of Chief Justices. There are only 54 Chief Justices in the country, state Chief Justices. And you might say, but there's only 50 states. Well, we also have Guam and Puerto Rico, and the District of Columbia. And then Texas has 2 Chief Justices. So that's how you get to this odd number of Chief Justices. But we spend a lot of time and energy focusing on this concept of confidence in the courts, which leads to confidence in the rule of law. And you're going to see me flipping through some pages here. The Conference of Chief Justices, I'll see if I can get this to not be blurry, not working very well. But anyway, we produced a report called The State of the State Courts. And it was a 2022 poll. It's a poll that's conducted every 10 years. And I was very lucky to be on the committee of the Chief Justices who engaged in this poll. And it reached out to registered voters to ask them questions about people's confidence in government and the judiciary. And I think there's some really interesting new narratives as a result of this poll that I feel, and you probably all do too, because you are consumers of information and you see this through the news all of the time. So public trust in government generally continues to slide downwards. And that's in all categories. It's the executive, it's the legislature, and it's the judiciary. And Americans across the board are losing their faith in the ability for any of these institutions to address equal justice. And those are things that are particularly concerning to me, especially on the equal justice side of this. George Chandler, who I can see clearly in my screen eating his lunch, knows that this is something that's really particularly important to me because we serve on a commission together that addresses access to justice. So what's happened over the course of the last 10 years is pretty scary. So 2012 versus 2022. In 2012, the judiciary held the highest public trust and confidence of the three branches of government. And then neck and neck in that are state legislatures and governors. So in 2012, the confidence in the state legislatures, and this is a national view, and governors was 59%, and the judiciary hovered at 73%. So a pretty big difference there in confidence in those government institutions. In 2022, everybody dropped, including the judiciary. So the state legislature now holds a confidence rating of 55%. The governors hold a confidence rating of 54%. Federal courts are 57%, so 73% to 57%, a huge drop. The US Supreme Court, 73% to 53%, a 20-point drop. And state courts, thankfully, we are now viewed most positively out of any category, but we also dropped and now we're at 60%. So you can see universally the confidence in the judiciary has dropped along with other branches of government, but at a higher rate. And this lack of confidence erodes confidence in democracy. We're supposed to be the backstop of democracy. And it erodes people's confidence in the rule of law, that judges will apply the law and apply it fairly. And you can see that the US Supreme Court leads the charge on that decline. And I will leave it to you all to surmise for yourselves why that drop for the US Supreme Court has been much greater than it has been for the state courts. I'm sure Representative Chandler will bend your ear about that. What's also really interesting about these numbers is, in a much more marked way, the confidence in institutions, or lack of confidence in institutions, is driven 100% across political divide. So you can imagine that Democrats, or in this particular survey, liberals, have a much lower confidence in institutions than conservatives. So we're getting more and more polarized, which also erodes confidence in democracy, erodes confidence in the rule of law. And we've seen the confidence in the ability of state courts in particular to provide equal justice to all. The number has flip-flopped. It used to be a higher number saying yes, and now it's a lower number saying yes. And then the other one that really also gives me pause is, and I'll read the question out loud. Does the following word or phrase describe state courts very well, well, not very well, or not well at all? And then the follow-up question is, provide equal justice to all. And if these numbers are broken down along racial lines. So if you are white or Anglo, nationally the number is 46% of people think we're doing very well with equal justice, and an equal 46% say not well at all. The Hispanic population that was polled here, 38% say, yep, we're doing okay, very well. 59% say not well at all. And I don't think this will surprise anybody in the room. The individuals who are polled who are Black, 30% say you're probably doing okay. And 61% say, not well at all. I find absolutely no surprise in that 61% saying not well at all. So these are all just statistics from a poll, you know, that we worked on at the Conference of Chief Justices, and we worked with really smart people who know how to do polls and crunch numbers and all of those things, because justices are not those people, to give us that snapshot of where we are in relationship to community. And while, you know, there's a little bit of silver lining that state courts are viewed most positively, there's also a lot of very sad takeaways from this, because if members of the public, whether they are voters or not, don't have confidence in government, it's going to reduce the number of voters over the course of time. And we're also just becoming further and further polarized in our views of the world, and really struggle. And we see this, you know, even in our own state legislature, you struggle to find compromise and middle ground. And all of those things are of great concern to me and my colleagues on the New Mexico Supreme Court. I think judges across the country feel this. I attend a regular meeting that's comprised of federal judges and state Supreme Court justices, and half are Republicans and half are Democrats, and we're appointed by all different kinds of folks. And we spend time together discussing this very issue, the erosion of this confidence in democracy, because we see what that does even on the day-to-day basis for, you know, what we would perceive as the small issue, like a traffic ticket, which it might be the end of the world for that person who's having to go to court. We see the erosion in the confidence, even at that smallest level, all the way through the really big ideas and the big issues, enforcing the Constitution, the state constitution, the federal constitution. So I think that is highlights, I think, the need for neutral information. It's very hard to find neutral information, as you all know. I mean, you can have a debate over whether some people say the Washington Post is the most neutral. I know that the New York Times is not the most neutral, but I still read it. We know that the Albuquerque Journal is not neutral. We know that Fox News is not neutral. MSNBC is not neutral. We don't have Walter Cronkite's anymore. And so we need, and I think people need to be aware of what those neutral sources of information are. And that's partly where you all come in providing that neutral information, which I really appreciate. So those are the big nagging concerns for me as a leader of a branch of government. And it's a very hard thing to tackle. And so we talk at the court about how do we increase public trust and confidence. And there are several different ways. Some are big and some are small. I think in New Mexico, we have a very robust judicial code of conduct. I know you all hear in the news all the time about the US Supreme Court. They don't have any rules of ethics. They don't have a code of conduct. I think we get thrown into the bathwater often, like people think that all justices don't have codes of conduct. We have a very robust code of conduct. We have an independent Judicial Standards Commission that enforces those rules. And then they bring issues to the Supreme Court for us to decide if somebody should still be a judge or not. And we also have a Judicial Performance Evaluation Commission, which I know most of you are familiar with because it ends up in your publication, where they're really trying to assess, is the judge doing their job? Is it the right fit? And things like that. So that's a big piece that we need to continue to make robust for that trust and confidence in the judiciary. But it's also smaller things. We have a rule of law program where we take the Supreme Court on the road, and we go into communities that don't often receive visits from, the Supreme Court, much less any court. Our most recent one was in Espanola about 3 weeks ago. And we had oral argument at the Northern New Mexico College. And we had 11 different schools attend oral argument as far away as Shiprock. They drove from Shiprock to Espanola to sit in on Supreme Court oral argument. We put together lesson plans for all the teachers. We fortunately have a very education focused state law library that's in our building. And so they help put together lesson plans for the teachers. The attorneys stay afterwards, answer questions about the case. And then we come out after oral argument, answer the students' questions as well. So the more we can convey to young people who will be the voters of the future what we do and how we do it, and that we approach it with great neutrality, I think that's something that also over time will increase confidence in the rule of law and confidence in democracy. So those are the things always on my mind, and always trying to figure out how to tackle them in creative and hardworking ways. But I've done enough of my own talking about what I'm interested in. I'd really like to know what you're interested in, and if you have questions about what I said, what on earth does the Supreme Court do, the legislature, what we do in the legislature, any of those things, I'm more than happy to answer questions.
Are there questions? Colleen?
When you heard oral arguments, was this an actual case? And if it was did it apply to the Espanola area?
So yes, our oral arguments are actual cases. It's not specific to Espanola. I mean, what we say will have statewide importance, but it's not specific to Espanola. What we try and do is pick cases that we think the students will find interesting. So this particular case was a search and seizure case, and whether the police can automatically tow your car to an impound lot and look for drugs. So it was relatable in that way. Last year we went to Las Cruces, and our case was about cattle rustling, which the legislature, somebody then tried to pass a bill to change the law, which would have been fine. That's supposed to be the conversation we're having. But it was whether you could have an independent felony charge for each head of cattle stolen, or if it was the act of stealing, say, 10 head of cattle and it's one felony. And the Supreme Court ultimately concluded that it was the act of the stealing, so one felony, not one per head. And that was a great one to use because we got to talk to the students about, if you steal one Snickers bar or 10 Snickers bars. So we really try to find something that the students can engage in. We're not going to take on a PRC case on the road because they would not find it interesting. So we try and be selective that way.
Questions? Becky?
So I have read about indicted people who are very poor, but may be incarcerated awaiting trial. And is this happening? Do they lose their jobs? Do they lose, and in the case of the impounding of cars, do they lose their car, which might be their ability to work, etc. So those things happening, what can be done about them?
So that's a good question, and it's a very different take on the question I'm usually asked, which is everyone assuming we just let everybody out of jail and run around like crazy before they go to trial, which is not true. Do not believe the hype. So in New Mexico, if a judge determines that somebody is dangerous, they can be detained. And it's a really important thing to talk about. And this will apply ultimately to the question about the car as well. 10 years ago in New Mexico, every criminal defendant that was charged with a felony was entitled to post a bond and be released unless you had shot and killed a police officer. So we're talking heads of the cartel, people who had committed murder, criminal sexual penetration, all of those things. They were all entitled to pay cash if they could afford it and be out walking on the street. And most of the people coming in and out of the trial court, and I was in Albuquerque serving as a trial court judge, most of the people coming in and out of our building had been charged, indicted with really scary things, and they were just out walking around and walking in and out of the courthouse unsupervised. And then the people who were very, very poor, who couldn't afford to pay bond, just sat in jail forever waiting for their trial. And it had no correlation to whether they were a danger to our community or not. So a low grade 4th degree felony. It could be shoplifting something, of a value of, $500. Would sit in jail until trial. And sometimes that's 1 year, sometimes it's 2 years, sometimes it's 4 years. And so we, with the legislature and the voters of New Mexico, said that that is not appropriate because of the very things you mentioned. The minute you go to jail, it doesn't matter if it's, county jail or the pen, but we're really talking about county jail people, you lose your job, which means you can't pay your rent, you lose your housing, you probably lose access to your children. It's a really significant event to be detained without any reason for detention except your ability to pay money. So we changed that through a constitutional amendment. And now the focus there is, are you dangerous? And are there measures we can take that allow for release, but that will still keep the community safe? Whether it's curfews, ankle bracelets, checking in with pretrial detention services every single day, whatever the issue is. Or are you just scary enough that we're going to say, yeah, doesn't matter if you can pay or not, you're dangerous, you should stay in jail. So 10 years ago, the folks that were detained, that were scary and couldn't get out, were very, very few people. Very few. We now detain thousands of people, which never happened before, because they are dangerous. So it's focusing on that problem as opposed to their ability to pay. But then going to the question that you've asked is, yes, people get detained and they lose their jobs and they lose their housing. And people are also wrongfully accused, indicted, and detained. And that's a really challenging issue to tackle, both for the judiciary and for the legislature. The legislature is asked every single year, change it back to the way it was, which is not a great idea. And so those economic consequences to detention are very real. For the Carr case, the individual was taken to detention pending their indictment, and their car was taken and moved to this lot under what's called the community caretaker provision in our law that says the police can't just leave a car randomly on the street. But there's consequences there too, because you have to pay money to get your car out of the yard, along with all of the things that you're paying for related to your arrest. And oftentimes people can't afford both to pay their fees and fines and get their car out, which then has a cascade of consequences, largely economic, from not having a car, because then even if they're released, they can't travel to their jobs. So all of these things are really, really complicated. But they're things that we think about, and they're conversations that we have with the legislature and with the governor about those consequences as well. This year, we passed, I think, a really important piece of legislation, and that eliminated just tacking on all of these kind of random fees to somebody's debt, not the fines, which are punishment, but just these random fees that the legislature over the course of 20 years had kind of tacked on to, like, if you get a speeding ticket, you had to pay a fine, which is the penalty. Then you had to pay all these fees that would go to, the judiciary's technology. It would go to the crime reparations victims fund. It would go to county jails, all of these things. And it was a way for the government to pay for government services without having to use general fund money. But because people are poor in New Mexico, people were going to jail because they couldn't pay the fees. So this was a really important conversation to have with the legislature this year. And I'm very grateful the legislature absolutely understood it. It got great bipartisan support. By the time it was heard in the Senate, there was only one no vote. That's how bipartisan the bill was. And the governor signed it. So that will, a year from now, it has a delayed implementation, but a year from now, that process will stop, which I think will help us focus on the punishment for something you have been convicted of, rather than really putting the onus to pay for a lot of important government services on the backs of really poor people. Yeah, and Representative Chandler was a big part of that conversation. Other questions? Yes.
You mentioned eroding public trust in institutions and media. Fixing that will take a very, very long time. What are your opinions on the best leverage points for exerting effort to address those?
I think it's two things. One is pretty fundamental, but has completely fallen apart, which is civics education. It's not taught in the schools. I mean, it might be in private schools, but yeah, I have two nephews who are in middle school, and their civics education comes from me, their Tia, because it's not part of what's taught. And so if we're not teaching young people before they become of voting age, what government is supposed to look like and how it's supposed to operate and why it's important, we'll never change the narrative. And then second is finding trusted community leaders to talk about this in their communities. And that's often hard. If I'll use I'll use Congress as an example. It used to be that our members of Congress were highly venerated and trusted people representing their communities. And so it's very hard for members of Congress to serve in that role anymore because of gerrymandering. We've created these voting blocks across the country that are so hyper one way or another in terms of political affiliation, that if you are a Democrat in a very, very blue district, you have to stay very, very blue in everything you're doing. And the same is true of the Republicans. And because you don't have these blended districts anymore, the opportunity for compromise and conversations about what's really the best policy as opposed to the best politics gets really, really complicated. So finding those trusted leaders to talk in communities is really important, but it's often hard to find because of this polarization. But those spokespeople who can serve in that role and really spend time with people. And that's a very slow process because that's one person at a time. And then teaching people across the country about what is truth and what are facts. And because we live in this instant information world, it's often hard to tell if something is true or not. We're being bombarded with all of this information from social media and the 24-hour news cycle. And so teaching people how to discern what is fake news versus real news and what is truth and fact, or not even truth, it's fact from fiction. And that also takes a very, very, very long time. There are no quick fixes unless we get everyone to turn off their phones and their computers and their televisions and talk to each other, which I'm not sure how to do that.
Other questions for Justice Bacon?
Berlin.
Can you see me?
I can't, I can hear you.
That's good enough. This,
Yeah.
All right.
Be able to see you.
how's this?
Perfect.
Thank you, and thank you for coming, by the way.
Yeah.
Thank you again. So I was going to say to you, well, in this new, that started with Think New Mexico, having a financial literacy class, which I also think is a fabulous idea as a former teacher. But I was thinking, I was gonna say, well, maybe they could get into some of this information that you were discussing about the bail and how you do it, and then you lose your job and then you can't pay for this or that. But then I was thinking, Christine, that maybe what really needs to be is, I'm all about getting rid of Algebra 2, to just tell you that. But I think that one of the classes that should be there, yeah, no, I wouldn't even graduate, but
Me either.
scientist, so it's fine. But I think, you know, that we would have a civics class so that people would know more about their rights and obligations and all of the things that you've just spoken. Well, I'm not sure how that gets about Christine, but
The Ed committee, the Ed.
as Ed committee, well, I'll get on to those people.
You know all those people.
So I think it's gonna be a really good thing to, you know, to be talking about as well. And, you know, I think the judges, as opposed to just teachers, to be the people who, and justices, of course, who would lead that in which way that it should go, and not someone in Texas making a textbook. So that's why. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that that idea. It you know, oftentimes feels like moving a mountain, but we all, you know, if we can even chip away at it a little bit. I spoke about these issues at Santa Fe Prep last Friday, and so at least that was a step towards teaching young people about what it is we do and how things work, and hopefully was, you know, of some help to them as they are on the precipice of becoming voters.
Thank you. Other questions? Other questions of Justice Bacon? Yes, Eddie.
I don't want to open a can of worms here, but we're all terribly saddened and terribly aware of what's happening with gun control. And I just wondered, in a nutshell, if you personally have ever felt threatened or needed to have any kind of personal guard, or police escort, or what have you.
Yeah, so judicial security is it's a very troubling kind of state of affairs in New Mexico in particular. As I mentioned earlier, I travel all over the time to Conference of Chief Justices, and those justices travel with security. They often have drivers to take them hither and fro, just like the governor. The governor has 4 armed guards. I don't have an armed security officer at the Supreme Court building in New Mexico. I don't, you know, in all modern buildings, you know, you walk through doors by using a pass card so that you can have security. We don't have any of that. I'm telling you all the secrets about the Supreme Court. And it's very scary. There are times that I have felt threatened. As a trial court judge, I sat on the first really big officer involved shooting in Albuquerque. There were a series of them. There were 3. I tried 2 of them. And the people that were threatening me were law enforcement, which is very scary. So my house is covered in cameras, and I have an alarm system, and I have a dog. I am not comfortable owning a weapon, despite many people saying, you need to carry a gun. I'm like, nope, I'd end up shooting my foot. But it is something that we're very concerned about. And it's a conversation we have from a funding perspective with the legislature. And we got some money this year for security. Will it be enough? No. But it's a step forward. We are on the precipice of hearing some very, controversial cases related to abortion access. There are at least 2 cases pending in front of us right now. And I am very concerned for the safety, not just of me, but of our staff as well. And the staff are the front line. Our poor librarians, like when you walk through the front doors of the Supreme Court, the first place you end up is the library. And I worry about our librarians, because somebody coming in with a weapon because they're mad about something isn't going to discern between, oh, you're a librarian, I'm not going to shoot you. I'm really looking for a justice. Nobody knows who we are. And I also worry because I'm not sure that I'm the target, but I think our building is a target. So these are things that are really concerning. Representative Chandler knows this because I talk about it in front of the legislature. When January 6th happened, the legislature and the governor promptly put up all this fencing around the legislature or the roundhouse. Well, the roundhouse is here and the Supreme Court is right next door. I mean, we share a driveway. The fencing stopped at the edge of the roundhouse, and they just left the Supreme Court sitting out there without any fencing and without any security. So these are the challenges that judges face, is that people I think they don't take it seriously enough. And so we work on it as best we can, but it's all a funding problem. And the trial courts, the counties are required to provide security. So they have armed sheriffs at trial courts. That there is no such requirement in the law for the Supreme Court or the Court of Appeals in Albuquerque. So we don't benefit from that at all. And judges are increasingly becoming targets, and where they're becoming targets very scarily is in their own homes. Most judges who have been murdered in the last 5 years have been killed in their own homes. And you don't hear about legislators being killed in their own homes. Very few with governors. Christine Whitmer is a different story because she had these people who wanted to kidnap her, but she had security. And we just don't have that kind of security. And it gets scary when you have somebody in Albuquerque running around with the gun shooting at legislators' homes. So I think, as hard as it is to say, I think it gave the legislature a new appreciation for those challenges. Fortunately, with that gentleman, nobody was hurt, but it could have been much, much worse. And so, yeah, those are things that we're very concerned about and have to cobble together how we protect ourselves.
Other questions for Justice Bacon? Other questions? David.
There's increasing number of very rich people and very rich corporations who are very interested in influencing the activities in government. What is your perspective on that? I mean, are you seeing evidence of increasing problems or advantages of what?
So you do, you've got, on both sides, you have these like bazillionaire people who want to influence elections. And it happens all over the country and it happens on both sides. From my perspective, that influx of that kind of money isn't a healthy thing, because government is supposed to be representative of all of the people, not just the uber wealthy people who have very specific agendas. So I think that's part of this erosion in the trust in democracy. Where I've seen it from on a more personal level very recently, that was, to me, very troubling, was the Supreme Court race in Wisconsin that just happened 3 weeks ago. And it was really interesting to watch from afar. In New Mexico, we're the only state in the country for state court judges that we publicly finance those races. So I'm not out asking for money. I'm not allowed to ask for money. And my finance committee isn't out asking for money because the state pays for our races. And that has kept judicial races very reasonable in terms of cost. And we can have a whole different conversation about whether judges should run for office or not. But that's a different issue. But at least in New Mexico, we're very unique. We're a little unicorn that we have public financing. And so we've been able to keep that really big money out of New Mexico. In Wisconsin, not only was that big money coming in from people who have very specific agendas, it resulted in the most expensive state court judicial race in the country in history. Millions and millions of dollars spent on who was going to have the philosophical control of that Supreme Court. What was also interesting to me about that race, and their code of conduct clearly is different than ours in New Mexico. When I'm running for office, and I've run twice, I'm not allowed to take a position on an issue that will come before the court. Because I'm not allowed to say to George, will you vote for me because we agree on X? Or I tell you I agree with you on X. And so we're not allowed to take a position on anything. We have to run on our qualifications and what we, that history and whether we're likable and approachable. And so we spend a lot of time saying, I'll be fair and impartial, which doesn't tell you a whole lot unless you look at, kind of somebody's biography. But in Wisconsin, they were running on the issues. They ran, both sides ran on abortion. And those Supreme Court justice candidates took firm positions on the issues and told the public how they would vote on abortion and gerrymandering. I would be disbarred if I did that. I wouldn't have a law license anymore if I did that in New Mexico. So it was kind of like this perfect storm of taking taking political positions publicly and this influx of millions and millions of dollars. And I think that is not a healthy thing for the judiciary as a whole. I'm sure I'll meet that new justice and I'll be perfectly friendly and kind, but I'll always wonder, how did that happen? And what will it do in the future?
Jean.
Justice Bacon, have you seen or do you anticipate cases coming forward in New Mexico related to drought or climate change?
I certainly do. Good question. You guys ask like the best questions. So in Bernalillo County, I was the water judge for 10 years as part of my duties as a district court judge. And I was also the MRGCD judge and the acequia judge. I did all things related to water. And that's how we have our judicial side of this set up in the state of New Mexico. You have designated judges to do the work so that we can provide education and training on water. And so I've already tried a case related to availability of water. It was a proposed development on the east side of the Sandia Mountains, another kind of golf course community, even though there's already a golf course community that's not fully built out. And of course you had one side with all of the geohydrologists in the world saying, there's plenty of water. And the other side with all these geohydrologists saying there's not enough water. And ultimately, I agreed with the folks saying there's not enough water for this type of community, and that the applicants had not addressed climate change in their application at all. So in our water, administrative water side, climate change and public, kind of that public safety piece of this is present in the administrative rules. So we have some beginning building blocks for that. I think we will see more litigation in New Mexico related to water than just about anything else. Eventually, I think we'll start to see it with oil and gas and fracking. There was an earthquake in Carlsbad this week that was 3.5. And that's a fracking issue. It's a known fracking issue. So I think we're going to start to see litigation related to that. And then we see lots of cases related to alternative energy. You know, the PRC is the body that assesses and weighs in on alternative energy sources and trying to reduce our dependence on coal over time. And all of those cases come directly to the New Mexico Supreme Court. So we see it already. I think it's going to grow. And we as a judiciary have to figure out how to provide that education and training to our judges, because most of our judges in the state come from a criminal law background, not from a civil law background, and certainly not a water or environmental law or environmental justice background at all. So that's one of the big challenges facing the judiciary currently and going forward.
Thank you. Colleen?
It's my understanding that indigenous issues are federal.
It depends. It depends.
You do have a role.
We do. Many issues related to tribal sovereign immunity come before the state courts because individuals file lawsuits against tribes, tribal members, tribal corporations in state court. And so the first threshold there for any judge is, do I have jurisdiction or not? And it can often be a complicated question. We had oral argument 3 weeks ago on a case related to tribal sovereign immunity, the gaming compacts, and personal injury law. And where can those lawsuits proceed? I can't tell you the answer because we haven't written the opinion yet, but it's not the first debate over tribal sovereign immunity that has been before the New Mexico Supreme Court or in front of the trial courts. I had several cases related to that as a trial court judge. And then I also represented some tribes in those debates as a lawyer. And so when it comes to land use, tort law, personal injury, things like that, there's many unresolved questions. And now there are interesting questions related to criminal law as well. The United States Supreme Court wrote an opinion 2 years ago that talks about criminal law jurisdiction. And the Supreme Court put criminal law jurisdiction clearly within the ambit of the tribes rather than the Department of Justice or the U.S. Attorney's Office. But now they are revisiting it already because that seems to be the way of our U.S. Supreme Court at this point in time. So there's lots of flux in there where you have that intersection of the relationship between the tribe and the state and citizens of the tribe and the state.
Oh, Becky.
So you pointed out that New Mexico has this wonderful thing that we don't allow judges to have to pay money to run for office, but should they be running for office? And
you took my bait.
Partisan, and what are the alternatives?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's very timely because Representative Chandler doesn't know she's on my call list. But I'm putting you're gonna be like, I'm not answering. The Supreme Court is putting together a commission to study this very issue. In New Mexico, judges run for office. So if and it's complicated, we're like this weird compromise state. When a vacancy occurs, notice goes out about come apply, and you're interviewed by anywhere between 16 and 21 people, depending on the level of judgeship you're applying for. And they narrow it down from that list to who they think is qualified for the job. And they send those names to the governor. The governor then appoints somebody. But when you're appointed, you then have to stand in the next general election. And anyone who meets the minimum qualifications, whether they have been vetted or not, can run against you. So I'll use myself as an example. I was appointed by the governor. I had to run in 2020. I was on the ballot in 2020, and a gentleman who I know ran against me, and he had not applied for the job, was not vetted by a nominating commission. So anybody can run against you, and you have to stand in that election. So I did that at the county level in Bernalillo County in 2010. And then again in 2020, because I guess I'm a sucker for the Supreme Court. And, you know, I navigated both of those races successfully. But it's very difficult for judges to have to run in partisan elections. So the other extreme from the two extremes. So Texas is one extreme. Judges run every 4 years, no matter what, and they solicit campaign contributions from lawyers appearing in front of them and all kinds of weirdness. And then you have the lifetime appointment, which is the federal model. And lots of states follow that model as well. You get appointed by the governor and you're confirmed by the Senate, and there you are for the rest of your life. The New Mexico Compromise was designed to be somewhere in the middle, but I don't think it's middle enough, and it's going to bear real consequence in the not too distant future, because we have so many counties in New Mexico where there are no lawyers, but we have courts that require lawyers. Or you have communities that have very few lawyers, and so the folks that are applying aren't necessarily qualified to be a judge, but it's the only person who's applied. And so the commission sends their name to the governor. And that's not a healthy way to build out your judiciary. So anyway, I'm putting together a commission, and Representative Chandler, as the chair of the Judiciary Committee, is an important part of this conversation, because I think this really requires the legislature to buy in. Judges will buy in. I think the governor will buy in. But it's really going to require the legislature to buy in, because they're the ones who established the system in the first place where we run. And so there's some in-between measures that I think are potential pieces of the conversation, that you could have the governor appoint and the Senate confirm, and then have retention. So if somebody really isn't good at the job, or isn't a good fit, or a good fit for the community can say enough is enough. I think having that as opposed to straight lifetime appointment is probably a healthier approach, but it takes that partisan label out of the electoral process. I mean, this is all partisan and political no matter what, because who the governor is matters, and who's in the Senate matters, and can you thread that needle. But it takes that pure, like just that really base political piece out of it, where we run around the state or your county saying, I can't answer any of your questions, but I know it's important to you. What I can tell you is I'll work hard and I'll be fair and impartial, which doesn't tell the voter anything. And so I think we need to examine where we are now and see if we can come up with a better way forward. Not only to take that base political piece out of it, but also to encourage people to apply to be judges, which is a whole nother significant challenge. Lots and lots of people who I think would be a really talented judge won't do it because they don't know how to navigate the political process, and they're not willing to expose their families and their lives to the electoral process, so they won't apply. We have suppressed salaries as judges. That's a problem. Our retirement, they changed our retirement to look a lot more like state employees. So if you want judges to come in and be judges, Representative Chandler's just smiling because she's heard me say all of these things a million times. You want lawyers to raise their hand to be judges when they're probably in their 50s. not in their early 30s, because you want them to have experience. But if they come in at 50 to get their full retirement, they have to serve until they're in their 70s. It's a challenge. So we have all of these challenges, and I want to put together a commission to have a real conversation about all of these challenges and what's possible to change what we're doing in New Mexico in a way that we would hope would be better for that, both recruitment and retention of judges. Because we need state court judges, and a lot of state court judges say, hey, I'm going to go be a federal court judge. Appointed for life, much greater pay, much greater benefits. And so that drain is happening out of the folks that you would want to be your state court judges.
Thank you.
Wow, you let me get on my soapbox about that one.
It's about our time with Justice Bacon. Did folks get all of their questions answered? Oh, Galen, one more. This is the last one.
Sure.
This is about the PNM Avangrid merger proposal that I understand there was a meeting last night where members of the PRC who had asked the Supreme Court to rule or to remand the case back to the PRC had admitted that they made an error in doing so. I don't fully understand all of that, and I wonder what your take on that is. Will the Supreme Court be hearing that case or what?
So I can't give you the ultimate answer to that because it's pending in front of us right now. But what I can tell you, because this is public record, is the Avangrid merger went in front of the prior iteration of the PRC, the elected version, 5-member PRC. And the commission said, we don't think this is a good idea. And they denied the merger. And so they came to the Supreme Court because all PRC cases, for better or for worse, come straight to the Supreme Court. And so they appealed. Avangrid and PNM filed an appeal and said, we think the commission got it wrong. And that has been pending in front of us, waiting for the briefing to be done so that we can have oral argument and decide. In the meantime, PRC and Avangrid and PNM have asked our court to dismiss the appeal and send it back to the commission, which is now the appointed commission that has 3 members. But one of those members used to work for PNM and is recused, so now it is 2 members. And there is dispute over whether that should happen or not. There is a party that disagrees, and that's the issue that's in front of us to decide now. And then depending on what we decide, other things will happen. So we're in the midst of deciding that motion to dismiss, to send it back to the PRC. And I honestly don't know what the answer will be from me or my colleagues, but we are working hard to try and get there. There's some additional briefing that the parties have asked to submit, so we're waiting on that, so that we have everybody's position before we just make that ultimate decision.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
for making the connection with Justice Bacon. This has been very educational. Thank you, Justice Bacon.
Thank you very much. And I really meant it when I said you guys asked really, really thoughtful and interesting questions. So I had fun. So thanks for inviting me.